Hi, so today I thought I'd start a sequence of videos about my reflections of teaching A-level economics and A-level business for 35 years in the UK. So the theme today is why young people are unable to think critically anymore, or certainly the decline in the willingness and ability of students to think critically over my career, which started in the late 90s, late 80s rather. Wow. Okay, so there are a number of reasons why. Somebody just passing here. Right, the first reason is the exam system itself. So when I first started, the exam questions set were quite open. So they invited a discursive response. So, for example, the best ever A-level question um, that they would throw in curveballs that were designed to see whether people could think originally and critically. So two A-level business questions that I just loved. One was using relevant examples, evaluate the importance of luck in business success, something like that. And then the other one was even more wild, which was this is remember, this is like late 80s, so it was following computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacture. There is a new computer-aided phenomena, computer-aided bankruptcy. Discuss. And obviously, what it was trying to get at, that question was that many entrepreneurs running small businesses try to automate their internal bureaucratic systems when they didn't have enough workload to justify the capital outlay of purchasing the equipment. So, it's a question about capital expenditure and sort of purchasing inappropriate capital equipment. So the good students would just love questions like that. The really smart ones, they could understand what the question was about, and they just wrote really interesting answers. And obviously, there was more than one way of answering a question like that, so the mark schemes were quite open. So the kind of the sheep-like student, they would just be absolutely destroyed by those questions because they couldn't think for themselves. In my experience, the kind of the unintelligent sheep student, what they wanted was, tell me what's going to be on the exam, like what questions are going to come up. And some exams were like that. I remember A-level politics in particular. Some of my students would do that, and they would tell me that what questions had been predicted, by their teacher. The teacher would provide them with model answers, and then all they had to do was just regurgitate it. So anyway, as time went on, the exam boards got rid of those sort of more open-ended, interesting questions, and what it was replaced with was very prescribed, painting by numbers questions. And also in economics, there was a lot of bias that just crept in. So the macroeconomics course was was virtually entirely Keynesian. And what was quite interesting about that was that by that stage, many of the teachers teaching that course didn't even realise that the course was biased, because they'd only been taught Keynesian economics themselves at university. So an example of that would be inflation. If they asked a question about inflation, and what is inflation? It would always be phrased around some sort of price indices. Inflation's the average percentage increase in the price level as measured by the RPI or the CPI. And if a student came at that question with an alternative perspective, like say a monetarist or an Austrian school perspective, that inflation actually is an increase in the money supply, and that would be marked wrong. So what you began to see happening was that examiners' subjective opinions were being presented as objective facts, and you better not disagree with those subjective opinions, because you're not going to get any marks. And that was the other thing that I noticed as well, was that a lot of the good teachers, they just couldn't put up with this, so they left. And that also applied to the examiners. So, in the end, the mark schemes became, I don't know, 60-page booklets with loads and loads of kind of prescribed answers. And if a student came up with an answer that wasn't on the mark scheme, it would just be marked incorrect, even though the answer would be factually correct. So an example of that was, I remember once there was a question about, it's only a 2-mark question, it was about, the student was asked to give an example of capital in the holiday industry. So one of my students wrote down an aeroplane, which is an example of capital. Capital is any fixed asset that's used by firms to produce consumer goods. And because an aeroplane, hotels were on there, I don't know, sun lounges, whatever. There was loads and loads and loads of examples of relevant capital, but for some reason, an aeroplane wasn't on the mark scheme. So this student actually got a cross next to their answer, because it was just marked by robots, basically. So, in some ways, what can you say? It wasn't entirely the students' fault, really. They were just responding to the system that had been created by the exam boards. That they were given predictable questions. They knew how they were expected to answer the question. Indeed, their answer had to follow a particular format. So, for an essay, for example, you might put one argument forward, and then maybe another argument, and then evaluate those 2 arguments later on in your essay. That wasn't allowed. The prescription went as far as saying, well, you had to present an argument, then immediately evaluate it, then present another argument, and then immediately evaluate it. And if you didn't do that, you lost about half the marks on the essay. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So what that taught students was that they had to follow rules, orders, in this case from the exam board. No room for critical thinking, no room for independent thought. All you had to do was listen, regurgitate and obey, and produce formulaic answers to formulaic questions. So that's one of the biggest reasons why students have stopped thinking critically. And as I say, I think many of these students are now in their 30s and 40s, and this is why we've got the situation that we've got with like Divic 91. People are just hardwired into just repeating mantras, other people's arguments, because they kind of know, they've been brought up to sort of think that critical thinking is a bad thing. If you think critically, bad things can happen to you. Don't stand out, hug the consensus, and all will be well. So that's the first reason. Second reason why things have declined in terms of independent thought is some teachers themselves. Typically these are the sort of. I'm not even going to talk about left wing, right wing, because it's not even relevant. What you've really got now is authoritarian versus libertarian. So you had a lot of authoritarian-minded teachers entering the profession, and they were sort of hardwired towards